The smell of smoke woke her before the sound did. Sable's eyes snapped open in the dark den, and her small body was already moving before her mind had caught up. Somewhere above the trees, the sky had turned an angry shade of orange that had no business being there at that hour. Her mother was already on her feet, nudging her siblings toward the mouth of the den with sharp, urgent movements that needed no words. Sable had lived only one full turn of the seasons, but even a young wolf knows the difference between an ordinary night and a night that wants to kill you. The wind carried heat now, not just smoke, and every animal in the forest seemed to be moving in the same direction at once. Birds burst from the branches in panicked clouds. A family of deer thundered past the den entrance without so much as glancing at the wolves beside them, because tonight there were no predators and prey, only creatures trying to stay alive. Her mother's voice cut through the chaos, low and firm. "Stay close." Sable pressed her body against her brother's side as they ran, weaving between trees that groaned and cracked behind them. The fire was not something she could outthink. It was not clever like a rival pack, or patient like a trap. It simply grew, wider and hungrier with every heartbeat, and the forest that had always felt endless suddenly felt like a narrow path with walls closing in. They reached the ridge just as the first wall of flame leaped across the valley behind them, and for a moment, Sable turned to look. She would remember that image for the rest of her life, the trees she had grown up beneath disappearing into a wall of light, the world she knew being erased in real time. Her mother barked at her to keep moving, and she did, but something in her chest had already changed. She had learned, in that single glance, that the world could turn against her without warning. The pack ran for what felt like hours, crossing a shallow river that stung her paws with cold, climbing loose rock that cut at her pads, pushing through bushes that tore at her fur. Somewhere in the confusion, in the smoke and the noise and the endless press of bodies moving too fast in too little light, Sable lost sight of her mother. She did not realize it at first. She kept running, trusting that the gray shape ahead of her was her mother's tail, that the shadow beside her was her brother. It was only when she stumbled into a clearing and looked around that she understood she was alone. The pack was gone. The smoke was thinner here, drifting instead of choking, and the fire's glow had shrunk to a distant flicker behind the hills. She called out, a thin, high sound that did not carry the way her mother's howl did. No answer came. She called again, turning in a slow circle, searching every shadow for a shape she recognized. The forest around her was unfamiliar. She had never come this far from the den, never needed to. Every tree looked like every other tree. Every sound made her ears snap toward it, hoping and dreading in the same instant. Night deepened, and with it came a stillness that was somehow worse than the chaos of the fire. Sable curled herself into the base of a fallen log, her small body shaking, not from cold but from the sheer size of being alone. She was young enough that she still expected the world to be arranged around her mother's presence, and old enough to understand, with a clarity that hurt, that this night it was not. She did not sleep. She lay with her chin on her paws, ears swiveling at every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, and she waited for morning, the way only a frightened young animal can wait, counting each unbearable minute as though counting could make it pass faster. When the light finally came, pale and gray through the smoke-hazed sky, Sable rose stiffly and began to walk. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that standing still felt like giving up, and giving up was not something her body would allow. She followed the slope of the land downward, reasoning without words that water usually gathered low, and where there was water, there might be answers. The forest here was different from her home. The trees stood in straighter lines than trees should, as if someone had arranged them on purpose. Stumps dotted the ground where whole trunks had once stood, pale and raw, like wounds in the earth. She sniffed at one and recoiled. The scent was sharp and unfamiliar, nothing like the rich, rotting smell of a tree that had fallen on its own. She pressed on, hunger beginning to gnaw at her sides. She was young enough that hunting alone was still new to her, something she had only begun to practice under her mother's watchful eye. Catching a meal by herself, in strange territory, with her nerves already worn thin, would not be easy, but she had no choice. It was near a wide, slow stream that she caught her first real scent of something she could not name. It was sharp, metallic, and layered with too many things at once: smoke, but not the smoke of the fire. Something sweet and rotten. Something that made the fur along her spine rise without her permission. She froze, one paw lifted, nose working furiously to untangle the smell into something she understood. A sound reached her then, distant but distinct. A rhythmic, mechanical growl, unlike any animal she had ever heard. It did not breathe the way a living thing breathed. It did not pause. It simply continued, low and steady, somewhere beyond the tree line. Every instinct in her small body told her to run in the opposite direction, and for once, she listened without question. She ran until the sound faded, until the strange smell thinned into the ordinary sense of leaf and soil and water. Only then did she slow, her sides heaving, her legs trembling with the effort. She found a thicket of low bushes and pushed herself into its center, hidden from every angle, and there she finally allowed herself to rest. As the sun rose higher, she thought of her mother, of her brother, of the warm press of bodies in the den before the fire had changed everything. She thought of how the world had felt small and safe only one day ago, bordered by familiar trees and familiar sounds. Now it stretched out around her, vast and strange, full of noises she could not name and smells she did not trust. She did not yet know the word for what she had felt in the clearing when the fire first appeared, or in the moment she realized she was alone, or just now, when the growling sound had sent her running. She only knew that something inside her had shifted, a new alertness that had not existed in her before, a readiness to expect danger, even in silence. By midday, hunger forced her from the thicket again. She moved carefully now, testing the ground with each step, pausing often to listen. She caught the scent of a rabbit trail and followed it with the patience her mother had tried to teach her, moving low and slow, letting the wind carry her scent away rather than toward her prey. It took most of the afternoon, but she succeeded, and for a little while, the ache in her stomach quieted. She drank from the stream afterward, watching her own reflection ripple in the current, a small, lean shape with wide eyes that seemed too big for her face. She did not recognize the animal looking back at her. A day ago she had been a pup among a pack, safe and certain of her place in the world. Now she was something else, something still forming, shaped by fire and distance and the strange growling sound she had not yet understood. As evening approached, she found a hollow beneath the roots of an old, wide tree and settled into it, curling her body into as small a shape as she could manage. She thought she might try to sleep, but every sound outside kept her eyes open. The call of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush, the far-off growl that returned every so often like a slow, patient breathing. She did not know it yet, but she was no longer simply lost. She was standing, without realizing it, at the very edge of a world she had never been taught to fear, a world that smelled of smoke, that did not come from lightning, of metal that did not belong to any animal, of sounds that never tired and never stopped. Somewhere beyond the tree line, that world was waiting for her, and though she could not have named it then, a small, cold seed of dread had already taken root in her chest. The night passed slowly, marked by every sound she could not identify, and when morning came again, she rose with her legs still trembling, but with something new steadying her, a stubborn will to keep moving, to keep searching, to find her pack, or find a place to belong, whichever came first. She did not know that the search would lead her, step by step, closer to the very thing that had made her run the day before. She only knew that standing still was not an option, and so she walked on, deeper into the unfamiliar world, unaware of how much closer she was drawing to the moment that would change her forever. 3 days passed before Sable found any trace of her family, and even then, it was not the trace she had hoped for. She caught her mother's scent along a ridgeline, faint and days old, mixed with the scent of her brother and sister, all of it trailing away toward the east. She followed it eagerly, her tired legs finding new energy, only for the trail to vanish at the edge of a wide, flattened clearing that smelled wrong in every way a place could smell wrong. The clearing had once been forest. She could tell from the stumps, freshly cut and weeping sap, and from the deep ruts carved into the earth by something heavy and wheeled. The strange growling sound she had heard by the stream had been here, she realized, and recently. The ground still held its vibration, faint but present, like the memory of a struck drum. She stood at the edge of the trees for a long time, torn between the pull of her family's scent and the fear that told her not to cross that open ground. In the end, hunger and hope won out over caution, and she crept along the tree line, keeping to the shadows, following the edge of the clearing, rather than crossing its center. It took most of the morning to circle it, and by the time she reached the far side, the scent trail had grown so faint she could barely follow it at all. She pressed on anyway, nose low, ears constantly swiveling, and it was this caution that saved her from walking directly into the wire. She smelled the metal before she saw it, a thin, taut smell of oil and rust threading through the undergrowth. She stopped short, one paw raised, and studied the strange barrier stretched between two posts. It was nothing like a fallen branch or a tangle of vines. It ran in perfectly straight lines, turning at sharp angles, enclosing a section of the forest as neatly as if someone had drawn it with a claw. On the other side, she could see grass that had been cropped short, and a structure in the distance, low and square, with smoke curling from one end. She did not go closer. Instead, she turned and continued along the fence line, her mother's scent now only a memory rather than a trail she could follow. She told herself she would find another way around, that this barrier was simply an obstacle, nothing more. But some part of her, the part that had grown sharper and more watchful since the fire, understood that she had just found the edge of something much larger than a single fence, something that stretched far beyond what she could see. That night she met the fox. He was old, with a scarred ear and a limp in his back leg, and he watched her from a low branch with the patient, unbothered air of a creature who had seen many young animals wander into his territory before. Sable approached carefully, unsure whether he saw her as competition or simply as another lost creature in a forest that no longer made sense. He spoke first, his voice rough with age. "Lost your pack in the fire, did you?" It was not really a question. She nodded anyway, too tired to hide the truth even from a stranger. He studied her for a long moment before hopping down from his branch, moving with the careful economy of an animal who had learned not to waste energy. "Follow the fence line long enough," he told her, "and you'll find where the two legs live thick together. Best not to go there. Not unless you enjoy having your fur made into something to keep them warm." Sable did not fully understand what he meant by two legs, though the description matched nothing she had ever seen. She asked him what they were, and he laughed, a short, dry sound. "You'll know one when you see one," he said. "Tall as a young tree, no fur to speak of except on top, and they carry death in their hands without even needing teeth or claws. They come in machines that roar louder than any bear, and they cut down whole forests faster than fire, except fire at least stops eventually." He watched her reaction carefully, and something in his scarred face softened when he saw how young she truly was. "Listen well, pup," he said. "The two legs are not all the same. Some carry that death gladly. Others do not. I have seen both kinds. But you will not know which is which until you are already close enough that it no longer matters. Best to keep your distance from all of them until you have no other choice." He gave her directions to a safer stretch of forest, away from the fence and the growling machines, and then he was gone, melting into the underbrush with the silent ease of an animal who had survived a very long time by trusting almost no one. Sable followed his advice for 2 more days, skirting wide around any place that smelled of metal or smoke, resting during the brightest hours, and traveling in the dim light of dawn and dusk, when the world felt safer, less watched. She found no further trace of her family, though she told herself, again and again, that they were out there somewhere, that she simply had not looked in the right place yet. It was on the 4th day that she saw her first 2 legs. She had been drinking from a small pool of rainwater collected in the hollow of a rock when a sound reached her, not the mechanical growl she had grown used to fearing, but something softer, rhythmic, almost musical. She crept toward it, curiosity overpowering caution for just a moment, and peered through a screen of ferns into a small clearing. 2 of them stood there. They were exactly as the fox had described, tall and strange, standing upright on 2 legs with none of the natural grace of a running animal. Their fur, what little of it they had, was pale in some places and dark in others, arranged only on top of their heads and in odd patches on their faces. They wore something else entirely over their bodies, colors that did not exist in the forest, bright blues and reds that seemed to announce their presence to every creature for miles. One of them, smaller than the other, was crouched near the edge of the clearing, very still, watching something in the grass with an intensity Sable recognized immediately. It was the same stillness she used herself when stalking prey. The larger one stood a short distance away, making the soft, musical sound she had heard. Speaking, she realized, though the words meant nothing to her. Sable's every instinct screamed at her to run, and yet she found herself frozen, watching. There was something almost hypnotic about how they moved, unhurried, unafraid, as though nothing in this forest could possibly threaten them. It was a confidence she had never seen in any animal before. Predators moved with purpose. Prey moved with wariness. These creatures moved as though the forest itself belonged to them, and for the first time, she began to understand what the fox had meant. The smaller one suddenly turned its head, directly toward the ferns where Sable was hiding, and for one impossible moment, their eyes met. Sable did not breathe. She did not move a single muscle. The creature's face changed, its mouth opening slightly, and it made a soft sound, different from before, quieter, almost gentle. It did not lunge. It did not shout. It simply stayed still, watching her, the way she might watch a bird she did not want to startle. That gentleness confused her more than any aggression could have. She had braced herself for teeth, for the roar of a machine, for the death the fox had warned her about. Instead, she found only stillness, only a strange, careful watching. She did not wait to see what would happen next. She turned and fled into the trees, running until her lungs burned, and the clearing was far behind her, and she did not stop to consider, until much later, that the creature had made no move to chase her at all. For the rest of that day, Sable moved in a daze, her mind circling back again and again to the moment their eyes had met. She could not decide which frightened her more, the idea that the two legs were dangerous, exactly as the fox had said, or the strange possibility that they might not be. Both thoughts felt equally unsettling, because both meant that the world she thought she understood no longer applied here. She found shelter that night in a shallow cave carved into a hillside, its entrance narrow enough that nothing larger than herself could easily follow. She curled into the deepest part of it, listening to the wind outside, and for the first time since the fire, allowed herself to cry out softly into the darkness, a small, mournful sound with no one to hear it. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every distant noise, real or imagined. She dreamed of her mother's voice calling her name in the language of scent and posture that wolves use instead of words, and she woke each time with her heart pounding, reaching for a family that was not there. By the time dawn arrived, something in her had hardened. She could not keep wandering aimlessly, hoping to stumble upon her pack by chance. She needed a plan, a direction, something more certain than hope. She remembered the fox's words about the two legs living thick together somewhere beyond the fence, and she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go closer, not to seek them out, but to understand them. If she was going to survive in this changed world, she could not simply run from every unfamiliar smell and sound forever. She needed to know what she was truly afraid of. It was not bravery, not exactly. It was closer to desperation, the kind that makes a young, frightened creature choose the harder path, simply because every other path has already led to more fear. She left the shallow cave as the sun climbed, moving with more purpose than she had felt in days, tracing her way back toward the fence line, toward the low structures with smoke curling from their roofs, toward the world of the two legs that she still did not understand, but could no longer bring herself to avoid. She did not know, as she walked, that this choice would lead her directly into the most dangerous moment of her short life. She only knew that standing at the edge of that unfamiliar world and simply watching was no longer enough. Something was pulling her closer, some mixture of curiosity and desperation, and the faint, foolish hope that maybe, somewhere among the two legs, she might learn something that would help her find her way home. The path back toward the fence took longer than she expected, slowed by her own hesitation as much as by the distance. Every few hundred steps, she found a reason to stop, to sniff the air, to convince herself that turning back was still an option. But each time, she pushed forward again, driven by that same stubborn need to understand, rather than simply fear. By mid-afternoon, she reached a stretch of forest she did not recognize, the trees thinner here, the undergrowth cleared in patches, as though something had been walking through it often. She followed a narrow trail worn into the dirt, more careful now, placing each paw with deliberate slowness. The trail curved around a stand of birch trees and opened into a wider path, and it was there, hidden beneath a scattering of leaves and broken branches, that the world turned against her for the second time. She felt it before she understood it, a sudden, sharp pressure around her front leg, cold metal biting through fur and skin, and then a violent jolt that threw her sideways onto the ground. Pain flared bright and hot, and she twisted instinctively, trying to pull free, but the metal held firm, anchored to something buried deep in the earth. She thrashed against it, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, every part of her body screaming to run, even as her leg refused to move. She did not know how long she fought against the trap. Time lost its shape in those first frantic minutes, measured only in the throb of pain and the desperate pull of muscles against unmovable metal. Eventually, exhaustion forced her still, her sides heaving, her leg aching with a deep, steady pulse that would not fade. She lay in the dirt, trembling, and for the first time since the fire, she felt something close to despair settle over her. It was the sound of footsteps that pulled her from that despair into a sharper, colder fear. Not the mechanical growl of a machine, not the distant murmur of two legs speaking to one another, but the direct, deliberate crunch of feet moving toward her through fallen leaves. She froze, every muscle locking in place, and watched the trees at the edge of the trail. Two figures emerged. One was the smaller two legs she had glimpsed days before near the clearing. She was almost certain of it, though she had no way to be truly sure. The other was different, larger, moving with a heavier, more purposeful stride, carrying something long and dark across one shoulder that Sable did not recognize but instinctively distrusted. The smaller one made a sound, sharp and urgent, and the larger one stopped, raising a hand. They spoke to each other in that strange, musical language, their voices rising and falling in ways that carried meaning Sable could not decode, though she could read the tension in their posture as clearly as she could read it in another wolf. The smaller one pointed toward her, and the larger one's grip on the long, dark object tightened. Sable's heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled against the trap again, ignoring the pain, driven purely by the animal certainty that whatever was about to happen, she needed to be anywhere else when it did. The metal did not give. She was caught, utterly and completely, in a way she had never experienced before, and the two legs were walking closer with every passing second. The larger one raised the dark object, and Sable's entire body went rigid, bracing for something she could not name but understood on the deepest possible level. This, she realized in a single, crystalline moment of clarity, was what true fear felt like. Not the fire, which she could at least outrun, not the growling machines, which she could avoid by staying far away, but this, pinned in place, unable to flee, facing a creature whose intentions she could not read, and whose power over her life was absolute. But the smaller one moved suddenly, stepping directly between Sable and the larger one, one hand raised, voice sharp with what could only be described as command. The larger one hesitated, lowering the dark object slightly, and an exchange passed between them that Sable did not understand, but watched with every ounce of attention she possessed. The smaller one's voice grew firmer, more insistent, and after a long, tense moment, the larger one lowered the object fully and stepped back, though his posture remained tight with something that looked like frustration or anger. The smaller one turned toward Sable then, and for the second time, their eyes met. Up close, she could see details she had missed before. The softness of the face, the way the eyes did not carry the flat, predatory focus she had expected, but something gentler, something that almost resembled concern. It made no sense to her. Everything she had learned about the two legs in the past days had prepared her for danger, not for this strange, careful softness. The smaller one crouched down, lowering their body to seem less tall, less looming, and began making soft sounds, low and slow, nothing like the sharp commands from moments before. Sable pressed herself as flat as the trap would allow, ears flattened, teeth bared in a warning she hoped would be enough. The smaller one did not come closer. They simply stayed there, crouched at a distance, making those soft sounds, occasionally glancing back at the larger one, who stood watching with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Minutes passed like this, Sable trembling and snarling weakly whenever either of them shifted position, the smaller one speaking softly without approaching, the larger one standing guard with visible impatience. Eventually, the larger one said something short and sharp, gesturing toward the path they had come from, and after a long exchange of words, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the trees with the dark object still slung over his shoulder. The smaller one remained. Alone now, they shifted positions slightly, still crouched low, still speaking in that same gentle tone. Sable watched, exhausted and in pain, her leg throbbing steadily, her mind caught between the urge to fight and the growing, confused realization that fighting had done nothing except cause her more pain. She had never felt so completely powerless, and yet the creature in front of her had not, so far, done anything to harm her. The smaller one reached into something slung across their body and withdrew an object that smelled, faintly and unmistakably, of meat. They tossed it gently in Sable's direction, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that the scent reached her sharply, cutting through the pain and fear with the simple, undeniable pull of hunger. She did not move toward it. She did not trust it. But she noticed it, and some small, calculating part of her mind filed the information away. Food, offered without demand, without approach. Time stretched on. The light began to shift toward evening, the shadows lengthening across the trail. The smaller one did not leave, though they did retreat a short distance, giving Sable more space, settling onto a fallen log with the patient stillness of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. Sable's leg had gone from sharp pain to a dull, exhausting ache, and the fight had mostly drained out of her, leaving behind only a deep, bone-tired weariness. It was in that long stretch of waiting that something inside her began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. She was still afraid, more afraid in some ways than she had ever been, because this fear had no clear edges, no simple direction to run. It was not the fear of the fire, sharp and immediate. It was not even the fear of the trap's teeth biting into her leg. It was something quieter and stranger, the fear of not knowing whether the creature watching her meant harm or something else entirely, and the terrible vulnerability of having no way to protect herself either way. The larger one returned as the sky began to darken, this time without the dark object, but carrying something else instead, a bundle of metal and fabric that Sable did not recognize. He and the smaller one spoke again, their voices calmer now, though still carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Sable watched them approach together, every muscle in her body tensing, and she found herself doing something she had not expected. Instead of thrashing wildly against the trap, she went very still, watching, waiting, some instinct telling her that stillness might serve her better than struggle. The larger one knelt a short distance away and began doing something with the metal bundle, his movements slow and deliberate, occasionally glancing toward Sable as though gauging her reaction. The smaller one stayed close to her, still speaking softly, still keeping enough distance that Sable did not feel immediately cornered, though the trap ensured she had nowhere to go regardless. When the larger one finally moved closer, something in the metal bundle unfolded into a long pole with a loop at the end, and Sable's fear spiked violently. She snarled and pulled hard against the trap, ignoring the fresh pain that shot up her leg, but her strength had already been spent in the earlier struggle, and her movements were weak, more reflex than real resistance. The larger one moved carefully, unhurried, and slipped the loop gently around her neck, not tightening it cruelly, but firmly enough to hold her, controlling her without causing further injury. She fought against it for a moment longer, every instinct screaming that this was the end, that she had been caught, and there was no escaping what came next. But the grip, though firm, did not hurt the way the trap had. The larger one spoke in low, steady tones, and though she could not understand the words, something in the rhythm of his voice was almost calming, in the way a low growl from an experienced pack leader could calm a frightened pup. The smaller one knelt closer now, closer than before, and reached out with slow, careful movements toward the trap clamped around Sable's leg. Sable's whole body trembled, torn between the urge to snap at the approaching hand and the strange, exhausted recognition that she had no other options left. She chose, in that moment, not to bite. She did not fully understand why. It was not trust, not exactly. It was something closer to surrender, the kind that comes only when every other choice has already been taken away. The trap released with a sharp, metallic click, and the sudden absence of pressure sent a fresh wave of pain through her leg, as blood rushed back into the limb. She let out a sharp, involuntary cry, and both two legs went still, watching her with expressions that, even to her unfamiliar eyes, looked almost pained themselves, as though her cry had cost them something too. She could have run then. The trap was open, her leg was free, and though it hurt terribly, she still had enough strength left to try. But the loop around her neck held her in place, and beyond that, something else held her too. An exhaustion so complete that her body simply refused to fight any further. She sagged onto the ground, sides heaving, and allowed herself, for the first time since the fire had chased her from her home, to stop resisting entirely. The smaller one moved even closer now, slowly extending a hand toward her injured leg, murmuring softly the entire time. Sable flinched at the contact but did not pull away, watching with wide, exhausted eyes as gentle fingers examined the wound with a care that made no sense against everything the fox had warned her about. This close, she could smell them clearly for the first time, not the sharp metallic danger she had expected, but something warmer, more complicated, carrying traces of the forest itself, alongside whatever strange substances two legs carried with them. This was the moment, though she could not have named it then, that fear became something more than simple instinct. It became understanding, sharp and unwelcome, that the world was far more complicated than predator and prey, safe and unsafe, familiar and strange. These two legs held the power to end her life as easily as breathing, and yet here, in this exact moment, they were choosing something else instead. She did not know if she should feel relief, or an even deeper kind of dread, because a world where danger could look so much like gentleness was a world with no clear rules left to follow at all. As the last light faded from the sky, the larger one lifted her carefully, supporting her weight in a way that suggested practice, while the smaller one walked close beside them, still speaking in that same low, steady voice. Sable did not fight the movement. She was far too exhausted, and some quiet, exhausted part of her had already begun to understand that fighting had brought her nothing but pain, while stillness, strange as it felt, had brought her something else entirely, a chance, however uncertain, at survival. They carried her away from the trail, away from the trap and the fading light, toward whatever waited for her next, and Sable, for the first time in days, allowed her eyes to close, not in surrender to death, but in the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of having survived something she still did not fully understand. Sable woke to warmth, and warmth, more than anything else, told her that whatever had happened while she slept, she was still alive. She lay on a soft surface, unlike anything she had ever felt, in a space enclosed by smooth walls, the air carrying a strange, clean scent that had none of the rich, layered smells of the forest. Her leg throbbed beneath a tight wrapping, and when she tried to lift her head, the world tilted unpleasantly, forcing her to lie still again. A soft sound reached her, and she turned her eyes, if not her whole head, toward its source. The smaller two legs sat nearby, close enough to reach but keeping a respectful distance, watching her with the same quiet patience Sable remembered from the trail. This time, in the better light of what she now understood was some kind of enclosed den built by two legs, she could see them more clearly than before. A young female, with hair the color of autumn leaves pulled back from her face, and eyes that held none of the coldness Sable had expected from a predator. The girl spoke softly, the same low, steady tone from before, and though the words remained meaningless, Sable found herself listening to the rhythm of them rather than fighting against the sound. Ellie, the girl would later be called, though Sable would learn the sound of her name only much later, after many more days of cautious observation. Another two legs entered then, and Sable tensed immediately, her body remembering the fear of the trail, the raised dark object, the danger that had almost ended everything. But this newcomer moved differently. A woman, shorter than either of the others Sable had encountered, with quick, careful hands, and a calm, businesslike manner that reminded Sable, oddly, of an experienced pack member checking on an injured cub. This was Claire, though again, the name meant nothing to Sable at first, only the presence attached to it. Claire approached slowly, speaking in the same low tones Ellie had used, and knelt beside the soft surface where Sable lay. She reached out carefully, checking the wrapping around Sable's leg, her touch light and precise. Sable flinched but did not snap, watching every movement with wary, exhausted attention. There was something in the woman's manner, a kind of practiced gentleness, that made the fear inside Sable shift slightly, from sharp and immediate to something duller, more watchful, more willing to wait and see rather than assume the worst. The days that followed blurred together in a way Sable had never experienced before. She was kept in a space larger than the first room, enclosed by wire rather than stone, with grass beneath her paws and a small shelter to retreat into when the world felt like too much. Food appeared regularly, left at a careful distance and then increasingly closer as the days passed, and though she never fully relaxed in the presence of the two legs, she began, slowly, to understand a pattern to their behavior that had not been obvious before. Claire came each day to check her leg, moving with the same unhurried care every time, never forcing contact when Sable pulled away, never punishing her for growling or baring her teeth. Ellie visited often too, though less for medical reasons and more, it seemed, simply to sit nearby, sometimes reading aloud from something she carried, her voice a steady murmur that Sable found, against every instinct she possessed, oddly soothing. It was on the 5th day that Grant appeared again, the larger two legs from the trail, the one who had raised the dark object before Ellie's intervention. Sable's entire body went rigid the moment she caught his scent, and she retreated to the farthest corner of her enclosure, ears flat, a low growl building in her throat. Grant stood outside the wire, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between wariness and something that almost resembled regret. Ellie stepped between them, much as she had on the trail, speaking to Grant in a tone that carried clear tension even without understanding the words. Grant said something back, gesturing toward Sable, his voice rising briefly, before settling into something quieter, more resigned. Eventually, he turned and left, and Sable did not see him again for many days after that, though the memory of his scent remained sharp in her mind, a reminder that not every two legs shared Ellie and Claire's careful gentleness. It was Daniel who had returned with the pole and loop that final evening on the trail, Sable came to understand, watching him move through the enclosure area with quiet authority, checking wire fences and water troughs, occasionally pausing to observe her from a respectful distance. He was not the same man who had raised the rifle, though his size and manner had confused her in that first, terrified moment. He worked alongside Claire often, and though he rarely approached Sable directly, his presence became familiar over time, another piece of the strange new pattern she was slowly learning to read. Weeks passed, and Sable's leg healed, the wrapping eventually removed to reveal a thin scar that would remain with her for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of the trap and everything that had followed. Her strength returned gradually, and with it, a restlessness that had not been present in those first exhausted days. She began pacing the edges of her enclosure, testing the wire, watching the forest beyond it, with an intensity that Claire and Ellie both seemed to notice and understand. It was during this restless period that the true complexity of her fear began to reveal itself, layer by layer, in ways she had not expected. She was still afraid of the two legs, in the sense that she trusted none of them fully, and remained alert to every unfamiliar movement or sound. But the fear had changed shape entirely. It was no longer the blind, overwhelming terror of the trail, the certainty that these creatures meant only harm. It had become something more precise, more calculated, an awareness of power and vulnerability that she now carried with her at all times, a lesson learned in her bones rather than simply in her instincts. She watched Ellie carefully during the girls' visits, noticing small details she had missed before, the way Ellie's shoulders dropped when she was calm, the way her voice changed pitch when she was worried, the particular softness in her movements when she brought food, always placing it down slowly, always stepping back afterward to give Sable space. These details became a kind of language, not unlike the postures and scents wolves used among themselves, and Sable found herself, almost against her will, beginning to understand it. Claire, too, revealed herself through repetition and pattern. She was efficient but never rough, thorough but never careless, and though her hands occasionally caused Sable discomfort during examinations, the discomfort was always brief, always followed by the same careful gentleness that seemed to define her entire manner. Sable began to distinguish, without fully realizing it, between the sharp, unpredictable danger Grant represented and the steady, patient care that Claire and Ellie offered instead. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and pink across the enclosure, Ellie sat closer than usual, just outside the wire, and began speaking in a softer voice than Sable had heard before, almost as though speaking to herself rather than to the wolf watching her. Sable did not understand the words, but something in the tone reached her anyway, a kind of sadness mixed with hope that felt, in its own way, familiar. She thought, perhaps, of her own mother's voice on the night of the fire, urgent and afraid, trying to protect what she loved most. It was in this quiet moment that Sable came to a kind of understanding she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Fear, she realized, was not a single thing with a single shape. It was not only the fire that chased her from her home, nor only the trap that had caught her leg, nor only the rifle that Grant had raised on the trail. It was also this, the strange, unsettling vulnerability of being cared for by a creature powerful enough to end her life, and choosing, again and again, not to run from that vulnerability, but to sit with it, to watch, to learn. True fear, she began to understand, was not simply the fear of death. She had faced that fear plainly enough on the trail, in the moment the rifle had been raised. This new fear was quieter and stranger, the fear of trusting something she could not fully understand, of allowing herself to need creatures who held such complete power over her survival. It was, in its own way, a far more difficult fear to carry, because it offered no clear direction to run, no obvious danger to avoid. It simply asked her to remain still, and to wait, and to see what kind of world might exist on the other side of that waiting. As the weeks stretched into a full turn of the moon, Claire began speaking with Daniel more frequently near Sable's enclosure, their tone carrying a different kind of urgency than before, not concern for her injury, which had long since healed, but discussion of something else entirely. Sable watched them without understanding the words, but she recognized the shape of the conversation, the way their eyes occasionally moved toward the distant tree line beyond the enclosure, the way Ellie's expression, when she was present, carried both hope and a quiet, reluctant sadness. She did not yet know what they were discussing, but some instinct, sharpened by everything she had survived, told her that change was coming again, just as it had come with the fire, just as it had come with the trap. This time, though, the change did not feel like danger. It felt like something closer to possibility, though what exactly that possibility might mean, she still could not say. She spent her final nights in the enclosure, watching the stars through the wire mesh above her, listening to the distant calls of owls and the occasional howl of wolves far beyond the fence, a sound that sent a fresh ache through her chest every time she heard it, a reminder of the family she still had not found, still hoped, somewhere deep and stubborn inside her, to find again. Ellie visited on the last of those nights, sitting close to the wire for far longer than usual, her voice soft and steady in the darkness. Sable, for the first time since the trail, moved close enough to press her nose against the wire separating them, close enough to catch the girl's scent clearly, warm and familiar now rather than strange. Ellie went very still, her breath catching audibly, and then, slowly, carefully, she extended one finger through a small gap in the mesh. Sable hesitated for a long moment, every old instinct warning her against such closeness, against such risk. But the fear she felt now was different from the fear on the trail, quieter and more considered, and after a long, trembling pause, she leaned forward just enough to let her nose brush against that single extended finger. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Something passed between them in that brief contact, some understanding that needed no shared language to exist. Ellie withdrew her hand slowly, her eyes bright in the moonlight, and spoke one more soft string of words before rising and walking back toward the buildings beyond the enclosure. Sable watched her go, and for the first time since the fire had taken her family from her, she felt something that was not quite fear and not quite comfort, but a strange, uncertain blend of both. The exact feeling, she would come to understand much later, of learning to trust a world that had already taught her, in the harshest possible way, exactly how dangerous it could be. The morning of her release arrived without warning, though looking back, Sable would recognize the signs she had missed the night before, the extra food left in her enclosure, the unusually long visit from Ellie, the quiet, careful way Claire had checked her over one final time, her hands lingering slightly longer than necessary, as though memorizing the shape of the wolf she had helped heal. Daniel arrived first that morning, carrying a smaller version of the pole and loop he had used on the trail, though this time his movements were slower, more deliberate, clearly designed to cause her as little stress as possible. Sable watched him approach with far less fear than she would have felt weeks earlier, though a healthy wariness remained, sharpened rather than erased by everything she had learned. Claire and Ellie arrived shortly after, and together the three of them worked with a practiced efficiency that spoke of experience Sable could not fully comprehend, but could recognize as purposeful. They guided her gently into a smaller enclosed space with mesh walls, lifted by handles Sable did not understand, and though her heart raced at the sudden confinement, she did not fight the way she once might have. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that these particular two legs had never given her reason to expect harm, even in moments that felt frightening. The journey that followed was disorienting in an entirely new way. The world moved past her in a blur through the mesh walls, faster than she had ever experienced, the ground itself seeming to vibrate beneath her as the vehicle carried her away from the enclosure that had been her temporary home. She caught glimpses of forest flashing by, then fields, then forest again, each one unfamiliar, each one a reminder of how vast and strange the world beyond her original territory truly was. When the vehicle finally stopped, the sudden stillness felt almost as disorienting as the movement had been. Sable heard doors opening, footsteps circling around to where she waited, and then the mesh enclosure was lifted and carried a short distance before being set down gently on solid ground. She caught the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that struck her immediately as familiar in a way nothing had felt familiar since the fire. Daniel knelt beside the enclosure and, after a brief pause, opened the door. For a long moment, Sable did not move, some old caution holding her in place, even with freedom directly in front of her. She looked out at the trees beyond, tall and dense and achingly similar to the forest she had lost, and then back at the three two-legs standing a respectful distance away, watching her with expressions she had come to recognize as hope rather than threat. Ellie crouched low, the way she often had at the enclosure, and spoke softly, the same gentle tone Sable had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. It was not a command. It was, as far as Sable could tell, something closer to permission, an acknowledgement that this choice, finally, belonged entirely to her. She stepped forward slowly, paused touching solid earth for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, and paused at the threshold between the mesh enclosure and the open forest beyond. She turned back once, her eyes finding Ellie's, and held that gaze for a long moment, some final exchange passing between them that needed no translation. Then she turned and ran, fast and sure, into the trees, leaving the two legs and their strange, complicated world behind her. The forest closed around her, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, she felt something close to peace. The scents here were rich and layered, familiar in structure even if the specific plants and animals differed slightly from her original territory. She ran until her muscles burned pleasantly, rather than painfully, reveling in the simple, uncomplicated joy of open space, and her own strength returned to her. She spent the following days reacquainting herself with life in the wild, hunting cautiously at first, her skills rusty from weeks of provided food, but improving quickly, as old instincts reasserted themselves. She avoided anything that smelled of metal or smoke, giving human territory the widest possible distance, though she noticed, with some surprise, that her fear of such places had settled into something more manageable than the blind panic she once carried. She understood now, in a way she had not before, that danger and safety could not always be predicted by scent or appearance alone. It was nearly 2 weeks after her release that she caught the scent she had been searching for since the night of the fire, faint but unmistakable, carried on a shift in the wind from somewhere to the north. Her mother's scent, layered with her brothers and sisters, weeks old but real, undeniably real. She followed it with an urgency that outpaced caution entirely, crashing through undergrowth, crossing streams without pause, driven by a hope so sharp it nearly hurt. The trail led her, after a full day and night of relentless tracking, to a den site nestled into a rocky hillside, and there, finally, she found them. Her mother's howl split the evening air, the moment their eyes met across the clearing, a sound of pure disbelief and joy that Sable felt in her very bones. She ran the final distance without hesitation, and the reunion that followed was everything she had hoped for through every frightened night alone, a tangle of bodies, of nuzzling and whining, and the deep, wordless relief of a family reassembled after loss. Her mother examined her carefully once the initial excitement had settled, nose working over every inch of her, pausing at the thin scar on her leg with a low, questioning sound. Sable did not have the words to explain everything that had happened, but some of it, perhaps, communicated itself anyway, through scent and posture and the new, careful watchfulness that had settled permanently into her bearing. The pack had survived the fire largely intact, though 2 members had been lost in the chaos, a fact that settled over the reunion with quiet, shared grief, even amid the joy of Sable's return. They had relocated to this new territory in the weeks since, farther from the fence line and the machines that had driven them from their original home, though not so far that the presence of 2 legs was entirely absent from the wider landscape they now called home. Life settled into a new rhythm in the following months. Sable grew stronger, more confident, eventually taking her place as an important hunter within the pack, her experiences having taught her patience and caution that some of her littermates had not yet developed. She never forgot the trap, never forgot the rifle raised on the trail, and the wariness she carried toward unfamiliar 2 legs remained sharp and unshakable for the rest of her life. But she also never forgot Ellie's soft voice, or Claire's careful hands, or the strange, trembling moment when she had pressed her nose against a single extended finger and felt something pass between them that fear alone could not explain. These memories lived alongside the harder ones, neither canceling the other out, both true at once, in a way that had taken her a long time to understand. When she was older, and had pups of her own, she taught them caution the way her mother had taught her, though her lessons carried a complexity her mother's had not. She taught them to avoid the fence lines, the growling machines, the sharp scent of metal and smoke that so often meant danger. But she also taught them, in whatever way a wolf could teach such a lesson, that not every 2 legs carried the same intention, and that survival sometimes meant learning to read the difference, rather than assuming the worst in every encounter. Years later, on a quiet evening much like the one that had first pulled her from the safety of her den, Sable stood at the edge of a ridge overlooking a distant cluster of low buildings, smoke curling gently from their roofs in the fading light. She did not know if Ellie or Claire or Daniel still lived within that particular cluster of structures, or if she would recognize them even if they did. But she watched for a long moment anyway, some old, complicated feeling stirring in her chest that was neither fear nor comfort alone, but something woven from both. She thought, in that quiet moment, about everything the word fear had come to mean to her since that first night of smoke and flame. She had learned that fear could be sharp and immediate, like the heat of fire at her heels, or slow and complicated, like the strange vulnerability of trusting a creature powerful enough to end her life. She had learned that fear did not always point toward danger, and safety did not always announce itself clearly. Sometimes the two were tangled together so completely that only time, and careful watching, could tell them apart. True fear, she understood now, in a way her younger self could never have articulated, was not simply about facing death. It was about standing at the edge of the unknown, powerless and exposed, and choosing, again and again, whether to run or to remain still long enough to learn the truth. She had faced that choice on the trail, pinned beneath the trap, staring up at creatures whose intentions she could not read. She had chosen stillness, not out of courage exactly, but out of exhaustion and desperation, and that choice had shown her a world far more complicated than simple predator and prey. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of her pack from somewhere behind her, familiar and warm, and safe in the way only family could be. She turned from the ridge and made her way back toward them, leaving the distant lights of the human settlement behind her, though the memory of that place, and everything it had taught her, remained woven permanently into who she had become. She would carry that lesson for the rest of her life, passing fragments of it down to her own pups in the years that followed, and to their pups after them, a quiet inheritance shaped not by simple fear of 2 legs, but by a deeper, more nuanced understanding of a world where danger and kindness could wear such similar faces, and where true courage, she had come to believe, was not the absence of fear at all, but the willingness to stay still long enough to see clearly what that fear was truly asking of her. In the years that followed, whenever a young pup in her pack asked her about the thin white scar along her leg, she would settle beside them in the quiet of the den and tell the story, not as a warning meant to frighten, but as a lesson meant to prepare. The story of the fire that had changed everything, the trap that had taught her the true weight of powerlessness, and the two legs who had shown her that the world held far more shades of danger and safety than any young wolf could imagine on their own. And each time she finished the telling, she would look toward the distant edge of the forest, toward the world of smoke and metal and strange upright creatures, and feel that same complicated mixture of caution and quiet gratitude that had never fully left her since the night she first learned what true fear really meant.